The first team we're going to hear from today is the McDonald's team. To introduce the team and the project, I'll hand it over to Yola Oliver. She's the Director of Global Social Listening and Measurement at McDonald's. Yola?
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to present this project where we have some super talented students on the team that really went after understanding how organic social helps our overall sales and guest counts, as well as improves our brand affinity overall. And they took a stab at separating out patterns for both our everyday, always on brand social, as well as our campaign social. So there's lots of interesting patterns. They've worked so hard and looked at so many pieces of data. We really sent them quite a few pieces, from media impressions to paid, to organics, social, to replies and comments from our customers. So they had a lot to work with, and we're super excited to present the results. I think we found some really good patterns that we could use in our future marketing efforts at McDonald's. So with that, I'll turn it over to the team.
Awesome. So I'm just gonna share my screen very quickly. Okay. Yeah. Can everyone see my screen? All right. Perfect.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll just start with the team, and yeah, there's a bunch of us across, I guess, 3 time zones: so Pacific, the East Coast, and India. So it's been like a pretty fun experience about the past 8 weeks working with the team. I think I'll just do the introductions. I know there's a bunch of us here, but just in the interest of time. So on the leads, we had Alex, myself, and then on the technical side, Akshat and Tanya. So we were responsible for delivering the project, and we sort of worked in an integrated structure. So basically, we initially had 2 teams, but on realizing how interconnected the projects were, we decided to merge up, and Alex was responsible for engagement. I led Affinity, and Akshat and Tanya were responsible for sales. So specifically on the sales side, the organic side was led by Akshat, and Tanya led the sales side for campaigns. And with the analyst, we had Philip, who worked on the sales side, and Arnav, who worked on the sales side on the campaign side of things. And then moving on to the rest of the team. So we had Robert, Rohan, and Krish who worked on brand affinity. Jasmine and Daniel who worked on Jasmine who worked on the sales side. Daniel worked on engagement, and Ahad worked on sales for campaigns. So that's the team. So like I mentioned earlier, we were split across 3 time zones: the West Coast, the East Coast, and India. So shouts out to Akshat for making up just very weird times for him, but he was a trooper on that. So just moving on to the project overview. So we had 4 key questions that we had to answer, and the first one was, the impact of organic social on sales, and how we could use organic social to maximize sales. And then the second part was, how campaigns impact sales. And the third was, defining and optimizing brand affinity. And the last thing was just how we optimize for engagement. So basically, what actions can we tangibly take to increase engagement across the social media platforms. So at this point, I will kick it over to Akshat and Tanya to walk us through sales.
Thanks, Tigan. So hi guys, my name is Akshat. I'll quickly take you guys through the first part of sales, which has to do mostly with organic. So again, if you go to the next slide. Right, so I think the first part of our project had to do with identifying what the incremental impact of organic social is, and how we can then take some of these metrics and essentially optimize organic strategy to make sure that it adheres to sales and we can maximize conversions to that end. So we began by looking at a lot of data that we had. We had data on organic, paid, and additional signals. And we decided to take this problem through a time-based model. So, the process is essentially 3-step. We firstly started with organic signals, which is things like count of negative comments, post reach, among others. We combined that with paid signals, including comments on paid social, paid post shares, among others. And we included additional data such as Facebook impressions, TV impressions, and other forms of social media. In realizing that a lot of this is time-based and the impact of social doesn't exactly happen at that point, we introduced something called ad stock, which essentially takes into account the length of effect, that is, how long the effect of social lasts, when the peak effect occurs, and what is the retention rate across either side of the peak effect, in order to effectively convert these pure signals that are date by date into something that is more of a stock variable. And we pass this through a time-based model, to be very specific, an ARIMA model with exogenous variables in order to predict sales. And as we move to the next slide, here we see our results. So with the amount of data, we believe our model was able to capture the trends fairly well. We optimized our length of effect, peak impact, and our daily decay or retention rate. The numbers are sort of hidden for certain amount of anonymity, but we were able to get fairly good results. Our MAPE was around 8% compared to an industry standard of around 10%, and we were pretty happy with that. And this was a step jump from our baseline models, which tested at around 15 to 20%. And if you move to the next slide, which quickly summarizes our results. So before I go into this, I would just like to say a lot of the slides going forward, they'll have these dots. So they are relatively anonymized. I'll try my best to convey it in the best way possible, but apologies in advance if it sounds a bit confusing. But essentially, we realized that a lot of social has a significant impact of sales. We mainly realized that there were 3 key variables, which are somewhat hidden, that contribute to sales, and each of them had a certain impact. So the first 2 had a positive incremental impact on sales, whereas the last one had a negative. From these, we extracted standardized metrics that we could essentially optimize, and that could drive our social strategy so that it adheres to sales. So we maximized the first 2, we minimized the last. We realized that our first metric that we identified, it was consistent across a lot of posts and a lot of parameters that we analyzed, and therefore we decided to focus mainly on the last 2 metrics, maximizing one of them and then minimizing the third, that is towards the right. Moving to the next slide. To optimize social, we considered a 9-point framework, 9 ways in which organic social strategy can be updated to adhere to some of our results. And this is somewhat of a summary, and we'll go into depth into some of these slides. So firstly, we had length of post, where we found that there were a certain length of posts perform better. Same goes with product association. We also analyzed media types, which could be different channels that posts can be sent. This could be basically media types like video, photographs, etc. And we realized that some of them perform better. Same goes for channel, which is things like Instagram, Facebook, and other forms of social media where organic social strategy can be driven. We did a similar analysis for cultural associations, which essentially posts that reference cultural phenomenon, along with celebrity associations, that is posts that reference Instagram influencers, celebrities, etc. We also looked at the effect of brand social versus campaign. Campaign posts generally tied to a broader campaign, brand social being more less tied and more so organic. We also looked at weekday and day part to essentially analyze what is the right strategy, and we were able to come up with pretty interesting results. And we can take, and I guess the next few slides are just double clicking on a few of these. So again, if we move to the next one, right. So I think a lot of this is hidden. So I'm going to quickly brush through these and try and be as clear as possible. But we realized that, so first and foremost, the way we did this is we essentially looked at which differences are significant and which are not. And we did this through t-tests. And the metrics we used were basically identified from our ARIMA-X model. We realized that some posts perform better on the right. The difference is significant. And towards the right, there was not a significant impact on count of negative comments per reach, but nevertheless, some posts perform better. We further analyzed the current distribution, and we realized that the posts that we were recommending were less frequent, and these could be something that can be increasingly factored into organic strategy. On the next slide, we saw a similar effect with product association, where certain posts definitely significantly perform better on our first metric, whereas for the second metric, there was not a significant difference, but nevertheless, the one on the left performed slightly better in terms of sentiment. Once again, our current distribution was skewed to the side of posts that performed slightly worse, and we essentially recommend that the kind that performs better essentially should be prioritized to the extent that it's feasible with an organic social strategy. To the next slide, we further had media type, where we realized that towards the left on our first metric, one kind of post significantly performs better, the one that is circled towards the left. We further realized that a different media type that was relatively less used and therefore had a very high variation, which didn't allow us to make statistically significant conclusions. And that could be an interesting point to experiment with because some posts performed quite well. On the second metric, once again, the media type that was less used generally on average performed better. And by analyzing the current distribution, we essentially recommended that, while our first media type that performed better on our first metric could be is dominant, but other media types that are less used could be increasingly experimented with while factoring our other optimization results to make sure that we have enough distribution and variation among organic social. On to the next slide then. We looked at channel. Once again, we realized that certain channels definitely perform better than others. In particular, the one in the middle tended to be fairly well, performed quite good on the metric on the left, and was fairly good on the count of negative comments per reach. And we further realized that this middle channel was not the most frequent or not the most dominant channel, and efforts on it could be accelerated. And that was one of our takeaways from this analysis. To the next slide again, we looked at cultural association. How we define cultural association, and we get to it in a bit, is essentially posts that reference cultural phenomenon like St. Patrick's Day or anything broader than purely McDonald's specific events. And we realized that certain posts, once again, with or without, that's a bit hidden, but they generally perform better. The effect was less significant on likes and reactions per reach, but on count of negative comments, it was definitely significant by more than 4x. And we realized that these posts that generally performed better were less frequent among organic social. And our takeaway was that these can be increased within feasibility to make sure that our organic adheres to sales and we can drive more and more conversions within our strategy. As we move to the next slide, once again, on a similar front, we looked at celebrity associations. These are referencing Instagram influencers or general celebrities, be it Hollywood and others. And we realized that on our first metric, likes and reactions per reach, one of these kinds performed better. The effect was not significant on count of negative comments per reach. However, we do see that the one on the left definitely performs better, even though the variation is quite high. Once again, the one we see performing slightly better was less frequent among the current distribution. And we really see that it has the potential to drive organic and can be increasingly factored within strategy to make sure we are boosting sales to that end. Over to the next slide then. We looked at brand social versus campaign. And this was a very interesting finding for us. We realized that the effect was not significant on our first metric, although the one on the left, one on the right rather, tended to perform slightly better overall. And on the other hand, on our second metric, count of negative comments per reach, we realized that the one on the right was significantly better by almost 4x. And once again, we saw a similar distribution that the one that slightly performed better was relatively less frequent in our current organic strategy. And our takeaway was that it can be increased within our organic strategy to make sure that we are optimizing sales to that end. Over to the next slide then. We've also looked at weekday, and this was closely tied to our question of when the social team is posting, how should they be thinking about that process through a very data-driven framework. We realized that although the differences weren't significant, we did see that some days, the days that are mentioned towards the middle, did perform better on our first metric, but towards the end, we see some different days that are performing better on our second metrics, count of negative comments per reach. I think our biggest takeaway from this was not specific days, but our biggest takeaway was considering the variation that occurs in some of these metrics, increased experimentation and variation could bring about very interesting results. Obviously, after factoring the other optimization results, which can drive our organic strategy. On the next slide, we see a similar analysis conducted for day part, where once again, the results were quite interesting, but the biggest takeaway was increasing variation could drive very interesting results. This was basically our 9-step framework. I do realize that for a lot of you that have not been involved in this project, a lot of this is fairly anonymized, and what I'm saying might not make sense too much if you don't know what these different parameters are. But I really hope that this was fairly interesting for you guys. To the next slide, then, we looked at next steps. Obviously, we had a period of 8 weeks, but this project is dynamic. Social is highly important, and from our results, it can very much drive sales. And so we looked at next steps that are both immediate and long term. For immediate next steps, we looked at expanding the definition of ad stock to factor nuances of each signal. That is, looking at it not from one ad stock optimization problem, but an ad stock optimization problem that is different for each signal that we are looking at. We also recommend devoting additional resources to optimization, because obviously for our ad stock parameters, among others, our optimization was a factor of the time we had to spend on it. And I think more optimization could further drive down, or rather make the incremental impact more specific. We also recommend increasing breakouts in the optimization analysis, which could help in really finding out which of those exact streams in a sort of a tree format would be essentially best and could make the analysis fairly rich and more interesting. On a long term, we realize that a lot of this organic strategy differs by brand, social, and channel as well. And we think that our model is fairly scalable. And data in model inputs, we should break the data out by brand, social, and channel. This will be once we have collected enough data, because this can then drill down that incremental impact on a per channel and on a per brand, social versus campaign level, as opposed to a very high level. And we also recommend experimenting with other models, of course, as we generally do, Profit, LSTMs, etc., to see if any of those perform better. But I think that's more so a very experimental next steps. That concludes our incremental sales modeling. I will now hand it over to Tanya, who will take you guys through the campaign side of things. Thank you so much. Tanya, over to you.
Thanks, Akshat. So now we're modeling effects of incremental sales because of campaigns. And the framework we use to analyze that is through a controlled time series experiment, which is called BSTS. But basically, to like a non-technical audience, we basically first define the intervention period and exogenous variables, such as unemployment rate, gas price, income, etc. And then we use that to produce counterfactual. And then we see the statistically significant incremental impact of intervention on sales, which is the difference of those. And then some of our results are on the next slide. So then we perform on each campaign, both campaign effect on overall sales, which is this slide, and then the next slide will be kind of like campaign effect on product sales for the next slide. Oh, yes. Yeah, so for example, we can see that for certain weeks after the start of the campaigns, some of the effects will be significant and some will be not. And then we do that for every campaign that they are. And for the next slide, we also did some analysis on certain geographic regions, which is the focus group of that campaign target. And then we found that those regions definitely had like a higher lift in sales than the US total. Yeah, so that's basically it for our campaign side. Sorry, we can't like go over the specific details of each campaign because it's confidential here. So I'll hand it over to Sekun to cover brand affinity.
Awesome. Thanks, Tanya and Akshat. I will talk about brand affinity very quickly. And so for the purpose of this, most of the slides will be focused more on approach and less on the outcome. So for brand affinity, we thought about it in 3 steps. And the main objective was to come up with an integrated metric for brand affinity. And that was interesting for us because we thought about it in 2 ways. The first way being, what was the brand reputation, or the brand reputation, which meant like the sentiment that that people felt towards McDonald's on social media. And that was more difficult because it was more of a qualitative type metric, and the way we got around that was to use NLP and sentiment libraries to really analyze what people were saying about the brand, and try to quantify that. So that was the first step on the first side of things. And the second side was a bit more straightforward in that we already had those metrics. So that was more on the brand awareness side of things. How was McDonald's connecting with its audience on social media? So what was the reach like? What was the the level of engagement from both an active, which we call deep engagement, and a more passive, which we call light engagement? So how frequently were people commenting and sharing on the comments? How frequently were people liking and reacting to the comments? So again, two elements, which was one, how were people responding to McDonald's, which we called reputation, and how aware were people of what McDonald's was doing on social media, which we kind of called awareness. So that was our first step. So we selected a few metrics which we thought would be useful, and used a technique called Granger causality to validate the effects of these metrics on sales. So that was our first step. And then the second thing we did was we started refining those metrics, and this was especially relevant on the reputation side of things. So we put the comments through a bunch of sentiment libraries, and what we found was they were capturing a few things well, but they weren't capturing other things well, especially things like emojis. So the main thing we did on that was to really take the emojis into a format where the libraries could understand better to get us a more optimized sentiment score. So for example, if there was a smiley face, we sort of kind of recoded it to say that was something that should be treated positively. Or if there was like an angry face, we sort of coded that to mean something. So just helping the library along to get us a more optimized score. And then the next thing we did was we scaled and centered, because we wanted to get a sentiment score that was pretty uniform across board and something we could get into an integrated score. So we use these scores to basically scale and center everything for each of the social media platforms. And we kind of then put that together by like an equal weighted average to get the sentiment, or sorry, the brand affinity metric. So we kind of went from something that was pretty qualitative to getting something that was relatively concrete and quantitative. So that was pretty cool that we're able to do that. And just want to shout the team out on that. So that's the first slide. So I'll move on to this, just talking a little deeper about what we did on defining the brand affinity metric. So like I said, we broke out brand awareness into deep engagement and light engagement. And on the brand reputation side, we had the optimized sentiment scores. And so basically what we did was just equal weight. I'll talk about the rationale for doing that and what we could potentially do in the next step section. And the approach, like I said, we centered and scaled, and we took the weights on each of the centered and scaled scores to get an optimized brand affinity score for each social media platform. And then the last slide is really something we did, just at the end of the project, to kind of get a sense of what the comments were like. So previously the work we'd done was on the posts, and this slide kind of talks to what we did on the comments. So this was a bit of a deep dive we did at the end of the project to really see what people were saying and kind of understand, the texture of what people were saying about the brand. And we looked at this, from a negative perspective. What were because I think one thing we're trying to do was to optimize for reducing negative comments, because we found that was pretty interesting. And so we wanted to, we took a 3-step process. And the first thing we did was to extract. So we took all the comments, extracted all the phrases. So, you know, if it's a meal, you know, we did that. If it was like 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, and we kind of extracted those phrases, and then we tokenized the comments, and so basically put them into a grid. So if like a comment had, you know, a certain number of those phrases, you know, we kind of, you know, put that on a grid and index that. And then we ran a latent Dirichlet allocation. And the outcome of that, after running that LDA multiple times, was really 2 recurring themes. And the first one was, you know, product-based complaints and service-based complaints. And we had a third class of just, you know, just general complaints. And so by doing this, we're able to get a sense of what the negative comments we were getting were, and just, you know, what the types were. You know, unfortunately, which will be a recurring theme, we're not able to dive into detail as to what those comments were, but those were the 3 categories we got to. And I'll run through the next steps very quickly now. Oh, no, we don't have the next steps. Okay, I guess I'll just talk through what our next steps are. And so in terms of next steps, there were 3 things. Like I mentioned earlier, for defining the brand affinity metric, we basically applied equal weights. We know this is not necessarily ideal, you know, and so one thing that we'd like for the team to do going forward is to actually, as we get more data, is to actually see what the weights should be based on the connection of these metrics to either sales or customer experience scores. And so I think as we get more data and things start to become more significant, you know, that will be something that we're fairly confident the team would be able to do. And then the second next step for us was really around, you know, just a lot of things we saw were based on anecdotal evidence, just because I think a lot of things there wasn't like a lot of data to validate these things. And as more data starts to come in, I think it'll be more interesting, and we'll be able to get more statistically significant explanations for those things that we saw. And it might validate some of the things, it might contradict them. But I think, you know, it'd be great to start going from anecdotal evidence to actual statistically significant evidence. Yeah, and that's about it from me. I will hand it over to Alex to talk through engagement.
Cool, thanks guys. I know we're coming up on the 20-minute mark quickly, so I'm gonna try to be succinct and just go through the engagement slides quickly. So basically, you know, when we try to figure out what sort of posts and what sort of posting practices leads to the best engagement, we're really referring to maximizing something called the E/R ratio, which is shorthand for engagement, number of engagements over number of reaches for that post. So for example, if post A has a reach of 1,000, which means it reached 1,000 unique users, and it got 4,000 engagements on it, 4,000 over 1,000 equals 4. So the E/R ratio is 4. Post B might also reach 1,000 unique users, therefore its reach would be 1,000, just like post A. But post B might only get 2,000 engagements in total. So 2,000 engagements across 1,000 unique users reached, 2,000 divided by 1,000, that equals 2. Post B's E/R ratio equals 2. Therefore, post A does better than post B on an engagement front. And that is the basis by which we figured out which sort of posts got better or worse engagements. And so the first insight that we noticed with this metric, this E/R metric, was that certain types of social media channels actually got deeper engagements than other social media channels. And by deeper, we mean that a greater percentage of those engagements were not just the shallow likes and reactions, but rather deeper positive actions like comments, shares, conversations, debates, etc. So that was the first insight. Again, we've whited out most of the stuff. You know, the red bar, you know, at the very top row comes from the social media channel that got the best share of deep engagements. We can see that the second row shows another social media channel in which, you know, that 97% of the total engagements were actually what we call light engagements. just simple likes and reactions, not so much the deeper comments and shares that we wanted. Moving on to the second insight. The second insight was that for organic posts, certain media types, by media type we mean whether it was a video, whether it was a photo, whether it was text, got a better E/R ratio than other media types. Although we're not at liberty to say what it is in this public presentation, I think you guys can all imagine that the more interactive the post is, if you can play it and see it move in front of you, it logically gets a higher E/R ratio. And that truth was consistent across all different platforms. So if we found that media type A was better than media type B, media type A was generally better performing on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on everything over media type B. Insight number 3 was that posts, with a recognizable McDonald's food item, usually got more engagements than a post that did not have a recognizable McDonald's food item. And again, that's intuitive. People like clicking, sharing, commenting on something that looks tasty. What was interesting, however, was that there was a certain type of campaign post that never ever had any recognizable McDonald's food item on it that still ended up having a better E/R ratio than posts that did have a recognizable McDonald's food item. That was kind of the exception to the rule. And on the next slide, I'll explain why. And the reason was because for that specific type of organic post that just never had any recognizable McDonald's food item on it, the reason why you could still have a very good E/R ratio despite not having food items visible on it was because the tweets on it tended to be very short. It was usually posted on Twitter. The number of characters on it was very short and succinct. And so, the takeaway here is that short and succinct can still trump, it being more visually appealing by having a recognizable food item. I think we can move on to the fourth insight, which is sort of rehashing what I just said, which we found that on Twitter posts, the shorter the tweet, the better the E/R ratio was. So, keeping tweets under 100 characters was golden. I think we can move on to the fifth insight. Or that might have been it. So we were able to boil it down to four insights then.
Yep, that's it from us. I see we have a few questions. So Brandon, if it's, do you want us to go through them or?
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much. So let's take some questions. If you have any, send them via text chat. We do have a couple of that have come in. So the question is, what do you think the reason is for one social media platform performing better or worse than another that you kind of learned during this project?
Sure. I guess I can quickly take it from sales and I'll hand it over to anyone else who wants to add in. But thank you, Matt, for the question. I think this is mostly from like the sales side, which I worked on. We definitely did see some social media platforms performing significantly better. I think a lot of that was tied to some of those other parameters that we were looking at. We saw that certain social media platforms already were factoring some of those optimization insights, be it on media type, be it on length of post and others. And that we hypothesized that is a result of them performing better. Obviously, this is within the framework that we ended up looking at, but at least on the sales side, we saw that this was a major finding. Yeah, I'll pass it over to anyone else who wants to add, I guess.
Sure, you mind if I just kind of piggyback on top of that? I noticed the question also came in while we were going over the engagement slides. On the engagement front, engagement being defined as maximizing the ratio of engagements, positive actions per number of unique users that post reached. We found that it was oftentimes higher on one social media platform over another. And it really boiled down to what was the experiential use case of that social media platform. Certain social media platforms are simply broader and, catch more types of behavior than other social media platforms. As you can imagine, Twitter is mostly for tweeting. You don't see a lot of people commenting or sharing on Twitter. They mostly like, people use Twitter to tweet things or to like other people's tweets. On Facebook, you tend to see, more engagement because the range of engagement opportunities is just wider. People can not just like and post, people can also comment and share and, get involved in debates. It's just a lot more conversational on Facebook. Instagram is a much more narrow social media platform. People go there mostly to post pictures and look at other pictures. There's not a whole lot of debate or discussion that happens on Instagram. So it was very much determined by what's the fundamental nature of consumer behavior on that social media platform.
Great. I actually have a question. Talking about the posts with cultural associations, how did you determine what a cultural association was? And in other words, like, how did you come up with the terms or the words that would be considered cultural associations? And then similarly for the celebrity associations, how did you extract like the relevant celebrity names?
Good question. Our analysts ran a text analysis package in Python that parsed through a couple hundred different types, or every single type of organic post that was handed to us in the data set. And that package in Python would look for what we call proper pronouns in any of the characters or words in that post. So an example of a proper pronoun is something like Szechuan, like spicy Szechuan chicken nuggets. I don't remember if that was the actual name of the product, but Szechuan is a province in China. That's considered a proper pronoun, and therefore we label that as a cultural term. Another example would have been FIFA World Cup. Some of the posts, were very centered on sports advertising, and so FIFA is a proper pronoun. That's a cultural term. In terms of celebrity terms, classifying a post as celebrity, 100% of celebrity posts were also cultural posts, but not all cultural posts are celebrity posts. Celebrity posts would not only be proper pronouns, but they would also, be specific people's names, like J Balvin, the Colombian singer, Travis Scott, the rapper, Cactus Jack, which is his alias. So that's what we classified as celebrity posts. We tended to find that, and going back to the previous question on, different levels of performance on different social media platforms, Facebook versus Instagram versus social, that cultural and celebrity posts tended to perform very well on specific social media platforms. I'm not at liberty to say what they are in this public presentation, and did not perform any better than non-cultural and non-celebrity posts on another very large, used every day social media platform for very intuitive reasons. Certain social media platforms are just better for celebrity content to just go viral, and other social media platforms are not good at that.
All right, great. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, so I think we'll move on. Thank you so much for the presentation.